I think this is it.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me? I suppose we're waiting for Chris. Are we? Chris is the host.
Why does it say hold it? Ah, there we go. We just switched it. Hello, Roberto. You're muted.
I know. Hi, Tanya. Hi, Heather. Where are you?
We're in Tlaquepaque right now. Jalisco. We're in Jalisco.
Jalisco, no te rajes.
Y ya son las 11 para ti. Gracias por estar aquí con nosotros.
I've had a couple of very busy weeks.
Maybe we can do this so that Shirley's in it too. There. And not so much you. Oh, there you go. There you go. Whole panel of ladies. Was that? So that's our restaurant where we meet every week. So they're live and we're navigating the whole
hybrid thing, like getting audio and video that's good for everybody. And most of our speakers are virtual, so to have a setup that works for them too when they're screen sharing and make sure they can hear us and all of that.
Hi, Chandran.
Hello, hi.
Where are you?
I'm in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia.
What time is it?
It's 10 a.m. in the morning. It's nice, warm, and raining. I suspect you're on in sub-zero temperatures somewhere.
I'm in South America, Chile.
Okay.
It's 11 p.m. Very warm. We're entering summer.
Okay. And I see a couple of few people in a bar somewhere.
Yeah, that's where the club meets.
Oh, I see.
Hi, Brian. Hola, amigo.
Okay, we're within 1 minute of rolling. Do we need a mic? Not right now, right? I mean, that's for later. Is this mic live?
Not yet.
I think that was. You want me to use this one?
That is, yeah, that's good to go, buddy.
Is it, do I have to turn it on?
It's on.
It is.
I need sound preferences.
Is Chris joining us?
Oh, for heaven's sake, I gotta plug this in.
Heather, is Chris?
Come on.
Chris Hayes
Oh, you're
joining us?
Heather?
We're almost there, buddy.
Let me know when I'm ready to roll.
Real good.
No, I can mute him, but yeah, he's good.
Sorry, bud. Output, headphones.
Did I hear Brian? Here.
You do.
Yeah.
Sorry. Output volume. Where are they coming from?
Could it be that?
No, this is the thing, but I don't know why I don't have them coming out of the speaker. Yeah, that might slide.
Can you? Well, that's either way. That's good. Just able to hear us. Try to chat on. And are you able to get, are we able to hear you on the speaker now or not yet? Oh, that one, there you go. Okay, so what do you have left? I do not need the speaker to be heard.
Yes, but that's, I think, the only way that.
Okay, so mine are working. That's great. They're not coming through Zoom. I know what to try. Sorry, Andrew. Built-in output. There we go. We ought to be good now. Can y'all hear me in Zoom land?
Yep.
All right, good to go. We can hear you too. Fire away, President.
Welcome to meeting 1970. Pretty soon we're going to be in the future. Right now we're still in the past. 1970 of the Metropolitan Rotary Club of Eugene. Let's start with, before we do that, I should say that I'm not your regular presidential officer. I'm Andrew Werner, filling in for Steve, who was diagnosed with COVID, tested positive for COVID. He says it's different than life. He has a headache, but other than that, he seems to be doing okay. So we're sending, of course, our good wishes to Steve for a rapid recovery. So let's start with the four-way pledge. For all we think, do, and say, is it the truth?
It
It is the truth.
Is it fair to all concerned?
It is fair to all concerned.
Will it build goodwill and better friendships?
It will
It will build goodwill and better friendships.
Will it be beneficial to all concerned?
It will be beneficial to all concerned.
And now for Metro's own 2 additions, will it be fun?
It will be fun.
And finally, who is Rotary?
We are Rotary.
I love that slogan.
Photo of the week, I have to perhaps apologize for being irreverent here, but I chose none other than Bart Simpson here.
I like that one.
Aren't we forgetting the true meaning of Christmas? You know, the birth of Santa. All right, at this point, is Heather on? Is Heather with us?
Yep, I'm here.
Heather, would you be kind enough to introduce our Zoom guests?
I would be happy to. So to our guest speaker, let me introduce you to, can you hear me? I apologize for the audio, we're outside. So I'll start with the folks on screen. We have President Eric joining us from Port Orford. Hi, President Eric. He's joining us from the coast of Oregon. And we also have our favorite Chilean with us. PDG Roberto is joining us from Santiago. And just as a reminder to all of you, it is 11 p.m. for Roberto. So he's joining us past bedtime and we're happy to have him here. And PDG Claire is joining us from Newport, farther up the Oregon coast. And I'd like to introduce my friends. Sorry for we're sitting outside. This is Tanya Hall from the Seychelles Club. Am I pronouncing it right? In Sunshine Coast of Canada. She's here in Mexico with me. And her mom, Shirley, is also here joining all of us. So we are happy to be joining you. And let me scroll through and see if that's it. President Andrew, that is everyone online.
Well, thank you so much, Heather, and thanks and welcome to all our Zoom guests. I think we have some guests here at the table too. Kristen, do you count as a guest or not anymore, right? I mean, you know that you're giving about. So, and then Darren, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, and
Cindy, this is live.
okay, that's right. And finally, you are.
Eduardo and Ana.
Okay, very good. Welcome, Eduardo. And I think everyone else is supposed to be regular here, right? So no other introductions needed. Well, at this point, Chris, I will ask you to introduce our speaker. Okay.
Thank you. It's with great pleasure that I'm introducing you tonight to Chandran Nair. Chandran and I met around 28 years ago in Hong Kong when I was a contractor for the US government working at the Consul General there. And John Bon Jovi came to town. And the Deputy Consul General hosted a reception, and Chandran and I got to talking about our common interest in environmental technology transfer at that time. Chandran has had a very decorated career. He was born in Malaysia as the 7th of eight children of Indian parents. He studied biochemical engineering at the University of Reading in the UK, environmental engineering in Bangkok. He's lived in Hong Kong since the late 1980s. He served as chairman of the world's leading environmental consultancy for Asia and ERM for a number of years. After leaving ERM in 2003, he founded a Hong Kong-based nonprofit think tank, the Global Institute for Tomorrow, or GIFT. And Chandran and I talked a couple of nights ago about some of the common values between GIFT and Rotary, and we may spend some time on that later this evening. Chandran is now also on the executive committee of the Club of Rome. He is a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Governance for Sustainability and their Experts Forum. In his free time, he's published 3 books in the last 12 years. Consumptionomics, The Sustainable State, and Dismantling Global White Privilege. And Chandran's organization just convened a conference yesterday in Hong Kong about, well, I'll let that segue to you, Chandran, if you'd like to kick off your remarks. I'm sure people would love to hear about the conference, and we're looking forward to your thoughts on global reshaping the global rules of capitalism.
Great.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much. And a good day to everyone. I know you're all in different time zones, and it's a great pleasure to be here. So I'm speaking to you from Kuala Lumpur, which is the capital of Malaysia. I reside typically between Kuala Lumpur and Hong Kong. And in fact, tomorrow morning, I'll be flying to Hong Kong and spending the rest of December in Hong Kong. So Chris, I'll speak for about 15-20 minutes and then open it up for questions. I thought, based on what Chris suggested might be the issues of interest, I'd make a few remarks about, I suppose, the geopolitical issues of our time, which is the China-US relations and the issue of perhaps also Taiwan. Then start to sort of discuss a bit about the whole issue of the globalization narrative, and perhaps end a bit with what I see as very important, which is the ability of people from across the world to engage with each other, which is one of the key missions of the Global Institute for Tomorrow, what I call people-to-people diplomacy. And within that, of course, the things that you're all interested, which includes things like social entrepreneurship and other things. My main interest is in trying to understand why the world is so divided, and trying to bring about a better understanding of the world, and particularly within the Western world. I think the Western world is isolating itself from the rest of the world through a mixture of its own sense of exceptionalism and an inability to share power with the rest. So let me start with the discussions we had yesterday on a forum that we hosted, talking about the issue of a new multilateralism based on the notion of creating peace and stability and prosperity, and what that prosperity needs to look like, and that the current geopolitical tensions, mainly between the West, led by the United States, and China, are not conducive to prosperity and stability for the global majority. It has consequences. And one of the main themes that came out of yesterday's discussions was the need for the United States and China to back off for the sake of the rest of the world, and that they have an obligation to not allow their self-interest to get in the way of the interests of the global majority. That was quite a big theme. Clearly, China is a large country with about 1.4 billion people, therefore about 4 times the size of the United States. And its neighbor India will be the most populated country in the world in the next 10 years or 20 years, with a population of 1.5 billion people as well. And at the moment, there is a growing view in the rest of the world, and we had speakers yesterday, both in the United States, Europe, Africa, China, and incredibly diverse. And that was the whole point of it, to create platforms with diverse opinions. Many of the platforms that are being created, and I dare say that many of the United States listen to, are not diverse enough. The mainstream Western media is very selective. It's ideologically tethered to the biases of their governments, and thus do not allow for voices from other parts of the world to be heard. And what we tried to do was to bring varied voices. And so I'd just like to share a comment made by the American speaker we had. His name was Dr. Matthew Burrows, distinguished fellow at the Stimson Institute, former member of the CIA, State Department, and the National Intelligence Council. And his view was very interesting. He was the fourth speaker on the first panel. And the first three speakers for all Asians from different parts of Asia, from China, from Southeast Asia, and from North Asia as well. And what they said was essentially, when they started off, they had a positive view of multilateralism and the need for a new narrative around collaboration to address the existential threats of the 21st century, what they see as more profound than the desire for big powers to retain any sort of economic hegemony over the rest of the world, or to seek and maintain hegemony. And Dr. Burrows said that when he was the fourth speaker, he said that living in the United States, and he's based in Washington, steeped in the politics, steeped in US geopolitical discussions. He was a fellow of the Atlantic Council. He said, it is so interesting to hear you all say this. This is simply not the sentiment in the United States. He said he felt very pessimistic that there would be any ability in the United States to engage in a discussion around multilateralism and peace and stability, and to accommodate rising powers like China, and to be equal partners. And he said, there's one thing that brings both parties together, and I think you will not accuse me of being too opinionated when I say in your divided country between the red and the blue, if there's one thing that unites the Americans, it is an anti-China sentiment. And he couldn't see a United States led by politicians at this stage. And he mentioned 10 to 20 years of public sentiment changing towards a new understanding of the world. To that, someone asked him a question. Why do you think anti-China sentiment is so prevalent across the blue and the red states? Why are all Americans united in their antipathy towards the Chinese? And he said, well, it's very easy to explain. The fear of the rise of the others, the inability to accept that perhaps American living standards will have to will adjust to a new world, where Americans are not the only ones who are entitled to the good life, and the sharing would need for Americans to understand the American dream would have to take a different form and shape, because there are a lot of people in the world, and America is no more and will not be recognized as the only single power in the world. And that has large economic consequences. So it's that inability to understand all of that he thought was so difficult, and why across party lines, both parties are united on one thing, which is anti-China. I have different views on those. I have views that I suppose complement that, but if you're interested, you can read my book on dismantling global white privilege, which has nothing to do, not much to do at all with Black Lives Matter, taking the knee, or simple discussions about racism, but it's about power and about global power, which is manifested in the hegemony and the exceptionalism of the United States. So it was interesting to hear an American say he was not optimistic that there would be change in the United States, partly also because, as I speak to you, I'm always conscious that Americans do not like to hear some of what I'm saying, partly because for far too long, Americans have not invited others with a different view to speak to them about how the rest of the world thinks about things. So it's very important to understand that most of the world does not share the view that China is the #1 threat. Most of the world doesn't share the view that we should take sides between the US and China. In fact, we had an African speaker who said that we don't want to take sides. We want to be friends with the United States. We want to be friends with China. Do not expect us to take a side. And there was also a lot of discussion about much of the propaganda, the media. And you will all, I think, agree with me that when we talk about the global media, it's essentially the Western media. And today it's become a large, well-oiled propaganda machine that spouts anti-China rhetoric, anti-Iran rhetoric, and rhetoric about countries that these media channels don't fully understand, nor are they interested in forging better relations. So that's also was discussed as why, and they said it feeds off itself. As a populace that wants to be reassured that we are number one, that others are inferior, that we know what is right and wrong, they have lower standards, we stand for freedom, they don't stand for freedom, and all of that stuff. So that was the backdrop to that discussion. Then I thought I should mention that you will all know that the unfortunate and the tragic war in the Ukraine has, of course, also triggered lots of concerns in the West. If you're interested, I was asked by the leading French think tank who are producing a book around, is the Ukraine war the tipping point? And I said, only for the West. The war in the Ukraine is a walk in the park compared to what happened in Iraq, what happened in Afghanistan. But as soon as it happened in the Western world, in Europe, it became the most terrible thing that ever happened in the world. Most of the world don't think so. Most of the world don't think that that is the end of the world and that Russia is the public enemy number one. We understand history a bit better. So at that point, many of you will know, there was much talk in the Western media about oh, the next is China invading Taiwan. And I've been asked by many media groups, will China invade Taiwan? And I said, in your dreams. The Chinese are not so stupid. They're not going to be baited by Nancy Pelosi, Democrats and Republicans. And from the point of view of someone like me living in Asia, in Africa, and Hong Kong, I was super angry that a woman who's unelected in my region can think she can fly over here and play with fire. And that's huge arrogance and exceptionalism and essentially trying to provoke another country. But the Chinese are wise and they, of course, reacted with statements and flew a few jets to appease some of the nationalists at home. But the Chinese are not going to fall for silly traps like this. The other discussion about the power balance was just the data about, you know, the threat of war and Chinese power. The United States, depending on how you define what's a military base, is something like 600 military bases around the world. China has one. So when we talk about China as a military threat, it's sheer propaganda. The Africans talked about debt issues, and those are really interested can look it up in serious outlets, not the New York Times, about whether China has created a debt trap. So we have to really understand all of that. So China is not going to invade Taiwan. It's not going to be baited, and it's going to be patient. And the only actors who are seeking to entice China into a war is the United States and its European allies. China is going to be much smarter. I think sometimes the Europeans and Americans forget China is a 10,000-year-old civilization. It has great wisdom. So that's kind of the statement about the geopolitics. The reaction of the West to what's happening in the world, and is particularly manifested in its anti-China sentiment, one could call xenophobic, racist, and in many other parts of the world, although not everyone supports China, nor agrees with some of its foreign policies, etc. We understand. So some of my Indian friends say to me, well, you seem to be rather pro-China. And I say to them, I'm not pro-China, I'm pro-peace. And the provocation at the moment for war is coming from the West. And the history of provocation and West and warfare has essentially, if you come from where I lived in Africa, etc., was born in Southeast Asia, Vietnam War, the history is writ large. And we don't want to repeat. So what is very clear that I argue is the Western world, which essentially dominated the world for the last 300-400 years, is having great difficulty coming to terms with what I call a post-Western world. Post-Western world doesn't mean a world in which the West is on the receiving end of the power or the economic advantages of the rest. But a post-Western world is a world in which the West will not write the rules. And so when the Western world, led by the United States, speaks about the rules-based order, what they forget is that for most of us, we were not involved in writing the rules. The rules-based order is essentially the Western rules-based order, which is I win, you lose. Or you play by my rules, and we will see how far we get along with them. But there's no room for you to be essentially an equal partner with that. And China has been the first nation that is essentially in 400 years challenged that order. And thus it's public enemy number one. I say to my Indian friends, when you get your act together, which may not be likely given that it's a multi-party chaotic democracy, then India will be public enemy number one. But right now, India is a friend of the West because it's in disarray and it's not a threat. Final point about the end of globalization discussions in the West. This is, in my view, a rather shallow and sort of naive understanding of what globalization. The moment someone got onto a raft in Africa and the ocean currents took them to Papua New Guinea, or merchants in China traded with Mongolians and went to Iran and sold silk and traded salt, the old Silk Road, we had globalization. Colonization, the creation of the United States, was globalization. White settler communities from the West, from Europe, going and invading other countries, Australia, etc. So globalization is not about simply trade. It's much bigger and it'll continue. What we're seeing today is not the end of globalization, the rewriting of the rules of globalization, because the old rules were written by Western powers after the Second World War, the Bretton Woods Agreement, currently the exorbitant privilege of the dollar, which allows the US to sanction other countries willy-nilly, illegally often. All of this is part of that globalization of the post Second World War. Today, the rest of the world is tired of that. They want a new way of thinking about it. They do not want to be dominated by the reserve currency of the United States and the arguments that only the United States can be relied on to provide that. There are other mechanisms, and be assured that other people are looking at that. So that's the discussion, that there is no end to globalization, and globalization is not simply about who makes chips, and we will stop you from getting our chips. Well, other countries are not devoid of scientists, researchers, etc. They will find a way, and they might make it better, as the United States, I believe, will soon find out. So those are the sorts of discussions that I'm very interested in, I share. So we need a new era of global sort of promise, not a Western sort of centric growth model either. And in my first book, I said that one of the biggest challenges going forward will be the need to reject the idea of growth at all costs, what's called the Washington Consensus, that you can everything, you can consume everything. And in my first book on consumption, I argued that we will destroy the world in this part of the world where we will have 6 billion Asians in about 2050. We all try and ape the American lifestyle. There's simply not enough to go around. If all Asians drive cars, eat seafood and consume energy like you do or Europeans do, well, game over. So the question is, how do we restructure our societies? And in that, I argue that we will need very strong states. We cannot have the sort of liberal democracies that you have and you see that the United States governments seek to export to other parts of the world. It will have to be very different. It'll have to be strong states that essentially look to protect public and common goods. And where there'll be tough rules that do not allow for excessive accumulation of access to resources, etc., or wealth. It'll be a different model. Those models will redefine how we see progress and how we govern societies. The West believes that we should have its model, but it's a model that is essentially premised on 500 years of conquest, exploitation, extraction, and exceptionalism. It cannot be sustained in a world where we will have 8 billion people. So let me end with those things and say that ultimately the geopolitics will define our futures. But what is good and what Dr. Burroughs talked about is that finally we are beginning to see that the rest of the world, he called it the global south, I don't like that term, the rest of the world is standing up and saying, you will not dictate to us anymore. We will find different ways. We will form our own relations. Your enemies are not mine. If we seek to trade with Russia, we will, as India is. You will not suggest what is right and wrong. We do not want to be your enemy, and we will create a new world around that. And there cannot be a unipolar world, and we will have to have a world of plurality, where different governance systems have to be respected. They don't have to be seen through the lens of liberal democracies, but they do have to essentially address the challenges of the time. So I'll end by saying I think people-to-people diplomacy is really important. And that's why when Chris asked me to do this, I said I'd do it because, you know, it's very interesting. I rarely get invited to speak in the United States because in America, they don't want to listen to people like me. But I speak a lot in Europe, I speak across Asia, etc. And it's important for Americans to understand that American power is very important to the world. America has a very important role to play, but it has to free itself from its exceptionalism and understand that the rest of the world is moving on. It's moving on to a world in which there's respect for other cultures. It is not based on exceptionalism, which is rooted, in my view, in a deep-rooted sense of racial superiority over other people. And people respect the West, but they don't want to be bossed around anymore. And that's the period we live in now. So let me stop there, and I'm happy to talk about gift. And Chris, I can talk about social enterprises and things like that. But that's the kind of big picture I thought might interest everyone today. So thanks for your attention. I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
So I'm going to go around with the mic and I'd love to hear questions.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was extremely interesting. First of all, I mean, what can China do to regain the confidence of Western business leaders? One of the things that happened in the 1970s and 1980s was after China became more open, many Americans, and myself included, believed that through trade, we would develop a peaceful, cooperative relationship. That is the liberal economic theory that by trading more, we will have a more peaceful relationship. Well, after 40 some years, our relationship is more confrontative probably than it's been, since before the United States opened up its relationship with China. But getting back to the business leaders, I mean, one of the things that I've seen is that many business leaders in Silicon Valley in particular are aiming to migrate their investment away from China to India, Vietnam, other places outside of China, because they have seen China implement very repressive policy towards minorities and increase their assertiveness towards other Asian countries by increasing their naval presence in the South China Sea, and basically using their increased economic power to invest in places where they've become competitive with US business interests in other parts of the world. So again, going back to my beginning question, what can China do to increase the confidence of American business leaders who were so hopeful and had invested so many resources into China for a peaceful long-term economic relationship?
Thank you for your question. This is a common question. Firstly, the idea that American companies or multinationals have moral values and public good at hand and to worry about minorities and all of that is essentially an oxymoron. And I think this is all part of the ideological sort of bias that has been entrenched. The reality is, and today I read something else, that most American CEOs are caught between essentially the pressure of the American government to essentially put pressure on them to leave China. It is politics that is compelling them to leave and go elsewhere because of all the restrictions that are being placed by US politicians who are driven by the agendas I spoke about. So I hate to say to you that most American companies want to stay in China if the American government and its politicians did not put pressure on them. Now, China is the biggest market. China is where they will continue to make money, etc. That doesn't mean that there aren't issues in China, but nobody talks about the issues of multinationals across from the United States to Australia, European companies exploiting and repressing through the exploitation people in the Congo, in Latin America, in South Asia, etc. None of that is spoken about at all. And in fact, in yesterday's discussion, I think it was one of the European speakers who said, it's so interesting that when a Chinese company behaves badly, say in Indonesia, it's apparently the repressive Chinese government that did it. But China has economic actors too. And coming from my background of environmentalism and labor issues, I can cite 100 US companies that transgress labor laws, environmental laws, and continue to do so right across the world. But no one says that this is the United States of America. We say it's Rio Tinto, it's Nike, it's these companies, and then we target them. So I think this idea that there's some Chinese monolith culture, which is repressive, is all part of the propaganda. So yes, China must do better. The question really is, what must the United States do to understand China and stop being fearful of competition? The United States and its allies talk about competition. Much of the view around this part of the world is the West is afraid of competition. It can't compete. And thus it uses other ways to diminish the competitive advantage that other countries have to demonize them. So, I mean, I could go on about ethnic minorities and all the red herring stuff about genocide with Uyghur people and all that nonsense. Is there repression in China? Yes. Is there repression in the United States of Black people? Yes. Hundreds of years and continues to this day. It's just talked about very differently.
I have a question, but before I ask the question, I might ask people on Zoom to raise your hand, that icon there, just so we know if you have a question too. The question I have is, I was intrigued, curious about your use of the term strong states. What exactly do you mean by that?
Thank you very much. And again, I'm not here to sell books, but if you want to a long explanation. I talk about that in my second book, The Sustainable State. The simple thesis is this, that the world's population is 8 billion today. It'll peak at 10 billion. The majority of those people will live outside the Western world. The Western world is about 15% of the world's population, which Westerners often forget in terms of not being reminded of the arrogance of lecturing to the other 85%. The rest of the world is rising. That 85% will not be able and should not ape the economic models and the political systems of the West, which is based on the premise that the individual is king, the right to bear guns, and all of those things. And therefore, we will have to put tough rules in. So I often joke that the American president is often called the most powerful man in the world, but he can't even get his citizens to wear a mask and prevent them from carrying guns, which kill people every day of the week. So the rest of the world looks at that political system and says, that is so broken, we don't need it. But coming to the gist of your question, and I'll just give you an example. So in many parts of this part of the world, people should not be allowed to consume as is taken as a human right in many parts of the Western world. You can have 5 cars and no one can stop you. So I argue in my book that car ownership is not a human right. In our large crowded cities, overpopulated, car ownership will not be a human right. It'll have to be taken away, and a whole host of economic interests. To do that, you need a very strong state that is able to put in place draconian measures that essentially seek to protect the right of the collective rather than the individual. So in short, the collective welfare of the majority overrides individual rights and freedoms. That's essentially the gist of the argument. Car ownership, for instance, is not a human right. You cannot have a swimming pool in Delhi just because you are rich, because there's water scarcity. Who makes those rules? It's the state, and it has to be a strong state. What the strong state looks like, it's in the book. Most Westerners think when I talk about strong states, because of their political biases, that I'm talking about some Stalinist or Maoist state. No, I'm not talking about it. In fact, I argue in the book, and I'll finish, that the United States today is a weak state. It's unable to govern, but it's able to impose its power on the rest of the world. But it can't do it at home. It can't essentially liberate its people from its current trap. Poor people and the minorities and all those poor people have no way out because the state is weak. And so I argue the United States is an example of a weak state. And there are many other examples of stronger states, both in democracies and non-democracies. But I'm agnostic to what we call a democracy and what the West calls as non-democracies.
Thank you.
Dan, you had a question, and then we'll go to Deshaun's question in the chat.
Is that me?
And me.
And
Oh, wait, we do the chat.
yeah, right.
Dan, you are on mute, as far as I can tell.
No, I'm not on mute. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, I can hear you, yes.
Okay, thank you. Just a couple of comments. Actually, Chandran, you just answered, I think, the question that I was going to be asked, which was, what would you see as the alternative model to liberal democracy? So I think fundamentally you answered that question. So I'll just add a couple of comments. First of all, thank you for joining us this evening. I think it's very important for us to hear voices such as yourself. I have to add that I fundamentally disagree with most of what you're sharing, but not all of it. I think you make a lot of very good points. Certainly the West, there's many sins to point to, both historically and current. But in terms of many of your conclusions, including the fact that the West is fundamentally weaker, I fundamentally disagree with that and many of your other conclusions, because I think that what we're experiencing here this evening in this conversation is part of the fundamental strength of Western democracies. And even though it's flawed, I think it was Mark Twain, I don't know if you're familiar with his writings, but he said that democracy is just a terribly messy and ineffective way to govern, but it's the best available. And I'm paraphrasing. And I still think that's as true today as it was when he said it 150 years ago. But anyway, thank you. And again, I really appreciate your sharing your voice, as contrary it is to our common thinking. I think that's the value of hearing your voice.
Well, let me just quickly respond to that. Yeah, I did. I hope I did say that alternatives to models of liberal democracies are other ways of governing, fairer systems. They don't have to be called democracies. And there are many other examples around the world. And I dare say to this audience, the Chinese system is one that works for large populations. Now, I didn't say that the West should be weaker. I said that.
I'm sorry, I missed that. What did you say? The West.
I didn't say that the West is weaker. I said it has become weak, but it has also become essentially protectionist in its desire to retain its power. So, of course, we would like to see a prosperous West. I would like to see a prosperous United States. But what most of us don't want to see is a United States that gets away with what it does. And that the world will not tolerate. And history will prove this to be true. So I didn't say I want to see a weaker United States. Then there's always this issue about the strength of Western democracy. Well, good, okay. But don't export your stuff to the rest of the world and think it's the only way by which other countries should govern itself. The Chinese system works with the Chinese. The majority of Chinese support the Chinese Communist Party. This is something that's anathema to Americans and others to listen to, because you don't hear this. So other systems work. It's different ways of negotiating how we govern systems. So the strength of democracy is what? I would argue China is a democracy in a different way from your democracy. Your democracy is two parties drenched in money, corrupt, and we have idiots like Donald Trump who get into power and can create lots of destruction around the world. Now, I know some Republicans in the group may disagree with me, and we can beg to differ. But inept people with no governance experience do not get elected into the Chinese system. So you can have different systems, but why don't you respect the ability of other nations to govern themselves? And I don't think it was Mark Twain, I think it was Churchill. We've all been trained to understand the nonsense that people like Churchill spoke about. And we still look to Western leaders for the wisdom. You know, there are lots of other people who's talked about democracy is manifest in different forms and shapes. So in my book on dismantling global privilege, I also talk about narratives. And why is it that the Western narrative is the only narrative that we're supposed to, our reference points in the West. I was educated in the Western system. I've had to re-educate myself. So my terms of reference are no more Roosevelt and Churchill. I have people from all our other parts of the world I refer to as well. And believe me, others were thinking, writing books, philosophers, etc., in other parts of the world. They were not speaking in English, though.
Chandran, we have a question that came into our chat. I'd like to read it to you.
Sure.
Considering the limitation of the world resources, would you consider legitimate a competition among the states or nations within the world? How should the small nations position themselves in a competitive reality?
Well, the first point is that, you know, there are limited resources, and therefore we have to come to terms. And this was much of the discussion about the new multilateralism. You have to understand that much of the understanding about multilateralism, the institutions of multilateral order, were all Western constructs. They played an important role post Second World War, no doubt about it. But you know, after the Second World War, the world's population was just under 3 billion. In the space of 70 years, the world's population has more than tripled. So in 1980, in our lifetimes, the world's population was 4 billion. This is not understood by most people. So when you've doubled that population so fast, and at the same time, created technologies that are able to extract at low cost every damn resource in the world, we have a problem. And the problem has to be that those who consume, people like you and me, will have to be re-educated, if that's the word, are basically forced to consume less. Now, the desire to consume less, not the desire, the ability of the rules to force us to consume less is not something that liberal democracies are able to do. I might remind you, some of you may know, that the one and only American president who talked about the unsustainable nature of the US economy based on overconsumption was Jimmy Carter. That was used by Ronald Reagan then to say, no, we Americans have a God-given right to do whatever we can. So to your question, I think competing for resources is the wrong way to think about the future. If we compete for resources, well, don't pretend that you care about the people in Haiti and Africa, etc. That's liberal hogwash. You don't care. What we do care, what you do care about is, can I consume more? And my book, my first book in Consumptionomics, essentially says the entire economic principle of the liberal economic model is to get you to buy things you don't need with money you don't have, to impress people you don't like if you're middle class, right? And that's the American model, I'm sorry to say. So everything is underpriced. Why is obesity a disease in the United States? Because everything is underpriced, starting with gasoline. So the American president really cares, John Kerry really cares about climate change. We'll take out the price of gasoline fourfold. Then we will start talking. But you can't in a liberal democracy. So I don't think it's about, if you start talking about competition, well, the poor nations of the world have no chance. And it's very superficial of us to talk, what can they do? Well, they can't do anything. We're going to have to look at pricing things different. And the tip of that iceberg of that question is climate change. The United States refuses to agree to any of those conditions and refuses to raise the price of gasoline, because all the freedom fighters in the United States feel gasoline should be free or $1. But if you're really serious about climate change, at least match the European Union prices, then we can talk. That's how, so if it's a competition route, yeah, we're doomed. As the UN Secretary General said at COP26, we're doomed. We have to have a different way of looking at it. China, the United States needs to look at it. And let me put out something there. The Chinese understand this. And that's why the new term in China called common prosperity, to restrict what people can have and can't have, and to essentially shape expectations of 1.3 billion people to what they call modest prosperity. You can't have it all. You will have what is enough to live dignified lives, but not more.
Well,
Someone's got a hand up here.
Yeah, I have my hand up. Well, I generally agree with your anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist perspective. I just want to ask you, do you really believe that state socialism is the answer for Asia, or at least the smaller countries in Asia?
Thank you so much for that question again. I'm not anti-capitalist. I live in Hong Kong. I'm a capitalist. This is a very simple discussion that's always had in the United States. You're anti-capitalist, or you're a socialist, or you're a commie. And I'm sad to say, I'm sorry to say, this is how dumbed down the discussion has become as liberal democracies seek to defend their model of governance. China is a capitalist society, but it's not freehold capitalism that allows people to do whatever they want. So I'll just give you an example. And the state's role is to protect public good. Earlier this year, the Chinese government cracked down on the tech companies. And you all perhaps heard about it. And the main reason they cracked down on the tech companies was because they felt that the tech companies like Alibaba and others were purveyors of antisocial goods. And the main one they were concerned about was games and other things. And they felt that hundreds of millions of Chinese kids were now becoming addicted to games. So what Chinese government did was to say to these companies like Tencent, etc., you will take down these games. You will not be able to do this anymore. The American CNBCs and the Bloombergs reacted as though this was anti-capitalist. No, this is essentially social protection. And the state deciding that capitalism and doing business is good. The Chinese believe, as you'll understand, have hundreds of years of doing business, the first merchants of the world, etc. They understand. But the problem, the nature of the system today is to say, if what you do has antisocial consequences, we will shut you down. And so, you know, Facebook would not last a long time in China. So all those companies had to take down that stuff. The Western media, business media, went ballistic, thinking this was, oh, here come the commies again. All China was doing was protecting its kids. And China doesn't care if Tencent goes down. Doesn't care if tens of thousands of shareholders lose their shirt on that. That is not the job of the state. The state's role is to protect. So it's not a socialist or anti-socialist or communist or capitalist. I'm not an anti-capitalist. I'm a capitalist. You can call me what. My issue, my question is, what is the economy for? And over the last 50 years, the ideological war has essentially split us around, you're a capitalist, you're not a capitalist. No, its question is, how do we govern our economy? And primarily, I'll end by saying that what is the point of the economy? The point of the economy is not to create billionaires and millionaires, etc. For the majority of the world, the point of the economy is to organize the society so that resources can be allocated in the world, that the majority are essentially protected from losing public goods and lead dignified lives and escape the drudgery of life. Most Americans do not understand it, but go and talk to poor Americans. They understand it. And that's what the point. You can call it whatever you want.
Thank you, Chandran. Obviously, there are more questions and we could go on forever, but unfortunately, our time here for our session is limited and we still have to get on to club business. I just want to let you know that what we like to do is make a donation to Polio Plus in honor of the speaker, and we certainly will do that in your honor. So thank you so much for joining us, for giving us your time, your thoughts. I think there's a lot to think about. You may stay on here, but you don't have to as we, transact the rest of our session.
Please, one thing is there's a gentleman on Zoom who has had a question for a long period of time. Could you please recognize him?
Well, if we can make it short, but I mean, we are running out of time here.
We don't have time. We don't have time.
I'm sorry, yeah.
I mean, there are a lot more questions here too, so we'll just have to, wait for another time. Or perhaps what you could do is you could send your question to Chandran directly. Chandran, if you could post your email address on the chat, in the chat box, then people can communicate with you that way.
Yeah, Chris has my email address. You can put it through. Someone said, let's have another session. My speaker engagement fee is $10,000, but I'll donate it to charity. So you guys cough up, I turn up, I'll donate it. How's that for a deal?
That sounds like a deal. Thank you so much. Okay.
Thank you. Peace, everyone. Take care of yourselves.
Thank you. All right. Other announcements. I heard something about the gift exchange. I haven't been here for the last 3 weeks, so perhaps somebody else in the know knows something about that.
What?
What day? What?
Are we gonna have a gift exchange?
I thought maybe on the 27th, Steve said something.
Well, I mean,
But it's not organized yet.
if we are going to have a gift exchange, then we should know about
It's
that.
like white elephant thing.
Yes, okay.
Steve
Well,
was, I sent something to Steve and he was gonna send something out.
okay, well,
We thought you were gonna organize it.
okay.
I
So,
will, if you want me to, I will.
Yeah.
Okay.
well, we'll, okay, more later. Right now, we don't want to hear more about that.
Stay
Any-
tuned.
This is new.
Yes,
We've never
any,
done this thing.
any other announcements for the good?
Let's
No?
do it in July.
Okay, in that case, we don't have to talk about birthdays today since Andrea Smith falls on the last day of the month. So maybe we'll have a chance to congratulate her in person before she claims the tax deduction for the whole year. But I know that Kristen is supposed to give her bio, and at this point, I'm wondering whether we have enough time to do that. Or you want to do it? Okay.
We are staying here. Can you stay for her bio? Yes, nod. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. I mean, clearly the answers were long.